I'd like to start, if I could, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet today, the people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. And while we are paying respects, I'd also like to pay my respects to ANU's Professor Robert Cribb, a historian and an individual I think everyone in this room owes something to, either loves or at least respects. I'm Richard Price, I'm the Research Director of the Australia-Indonesia Centre, and tonight we will be talking about attitudes. And in this respect, the investment that is made by the Australia-Indonesia Centre into attitudinal research addresses but one of three of the objectives of the centre. We have three objectives, the first of which is to get a better handle on the attitudes of Australians towards contemporary Indonesia and of Indonesians towards contemporary Australia. But we want to do that in such a way that we understand not just what those attitudes are, but the drivers behind those attitudes, so we can start to do something about it. The second of the objectives of the centre is about engagement. It's about engaging researchers with researchers, communities with communities, governments with governments, and business with business. But most importantly, it's about getting the cross-engagement between those different stakeholder groups. And finally, we have a third objective that deals with research. It deals with research in a way that I believe encapsulates of the whole thing that we're trying to do in attitudes. Good research will change attitudes. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. We've just funded recently S.Y. Sweeney to do some attitudinal research both in Australia and in Indonesia. We've had focus groups running. We've also had surveys being undertaken. And from the latest research on the Indonesian side, and this has just come out this week, we've not released it yet, but the Indonesians were telling us that if we are to have an improved relationship between Australians and Indonesians, we need to take four things into regard. The first is to do things in partnership. The second is to acknowledge diversity of perspectives. The third is to provide mutual benefits, that everything that we do together provides a mutual benefit. And finally, fourthly, to provide empowerment to prevent us going backwards. And when I think about the way we undertake research and invest in research in the Australia-Indonesia Centre, we actually practice what we preach in terms of those four things. All research that we fund is a collaboration between Indonesian institutions and Australian institutions. All research that we fund takes into account multiple perspectives. Close on 48% of the research that we have undertaken to this point in time in areas that most people would think would be biophysical and engineering based, such as energy and agriculture and infrastructure. Around about 48% of that has been socio-economic and psychological research and arts-based research. We only invest in research that deals with the problems of both countries. And if you want to really garner interest in Indonesian research as Australians, you start to pay respect in terms of what they can provide you back as researchers in Australia. And we are reaping rewards from that. And finally, we're also, I believe, dealing with the issue of empowerment. By every research project that we run, the research leads of both Australian and Indonesian. We don't have researchers from Australia going into Indonesia and then subjugating the Indonesian research below Australian leadership. That's And so we believe that following those principles is incredibly important to set an example to others. So tonight, back to this evening. In addition to the quantitative and qualitative research of E.Y. Sweeney, we invest in other research dealing with attitudes, and we deal with that in an academic way to ensure that when we do start to unpeel the layers of the onion about attitudes, we do it in a rigorous, academically rigorous way. And we're going to hear about the results of 2 research projects undertaken by colleagues at Monash University to bring some of that rigour to what we are investing in. But that is just about my entire role for this evening, other than to wish you an enjoyable time listening to the great research that's been done. I would encourage you also to really get involved in the question and answer sessions later, which is going to be driven by our lovely Gemma Purdy, a research fellow with the Australia-Indonesia Centre. Gemma, if I could leave it to you to run the evening. Thank you very much.
Welcome, and thank you for so many of you for coming out this evening. I think I'm very excited about having you all here to hear this fantastic research by Monash researchers and lecturers on the Australia-Indonesia relationship. As everybody in the room knows, this is a proud tradition here at Monash that our researchers have such a deep and extensive knowledge of Indonesia and of Australia's relations with Indonesia, and this is just the latest instalment of that. So our first speaker this evening, I have great pleasure to introduce Dr. Agnieszka Sobocinska, whom some of you may not have met yet, even though she's been at Monash for a little while. Agnieszka is a Senior Research Fellow in the National Centre for Australian Studies, and she's an historian with research interests in the intersection of popular opinion and foreign affairs, particularly in the context of Australia and Asia and Western constructions of the Third World. She has recently received a DECRA, ARC DECRA, where she's working on a cultural history of foreign aid in Australia and Britain and the United States. She's author of a book, a fabulous book called Visiting the Neighbours, Australians in Asia, published in 2014, and I recommend that you find that one and have a look. And with David Walker, who many of you also know, Agnieszka co-edited Australia's Asia from Yellow Peril to Asian Century. This is work that Agnieszka carried out last year for the AIC, and I'm looking forward to her presentation now, so I'll ask her to come forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Gemma, and thank you everyone for coming today. It's actually really brilliant to see such an engaged community of people interested in Indonesian research taking place here, and also research into Australia and how Australia and Indonesia intersect. Now, I must admit, when I started this project, or when I took this project on for the Australia-Indonesia Centre last year, I thought, fantastic, a small, contained piece of research which perfectly speaks to my sort of research interests in popular opinion or mainstream political culture and international relations. It still speaks to those interests, and it was very interesting, but it definitely did not end up being contained. In fact, it exploded in terms of content and size, which is part of the story, as you'll see, where I'm trying to end up by sort of working out why has there been so much polling in Australia about Indonesia in the past 70 years. So that actually ended up being part of the question that I didn't expect. Now, just the reason why I was interested to take this on in the first place is because when you look at the Australia-Indonesia relationship, especially over the past 10 or 15 years, it's become one of those sorts of things that we know. It's common sense. We've been told so many times now that public opinion matters in this relationship, or at least it's something that politicians and journalists say that matters quite often. To take just one example, the one that I have illustrated the slide with, When Indonesian President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono came to Australia for that state visit back in 2010, back when Rudd was still the Prime Minister, they talked about all manner of things. If you cast your memory back, there was quite a lot of issues going on at the time with the aid relationship, the terrorism relationship, national security asylum seekers. But in his remarks, Yudhoyono mentioned popular opinion as being the most persistent problem. So he said, the quote being, the most persistent problem in our relations is the persistence of age-old stereotypes. So what ordinary people thought about each other. And as I'm hinting, this is something that's been going on for a very long time. The first Gallup poll, we're all familiar with the idea of public opinion polling. But actually the first Gallup poll conducted in the United States was 1935. The first one in Australia was 41. And the first one measuring Australian attitudes to Indonesia was 45. So almost, immediately with the invention of public opinion polling in Australia, one of the main issues after the war had concluded when it came to international relations was what did Australians think about the new countries to the north, and namely Indonesia after the Declaration of Independence. So it's a question, polling has been part of this relationship almost from the very beginning. Before I go too far into what I found looking at these polls, of course we have to be very careful when we're talking about polling. I'm not talking, this isn't as much as the social sciences in this case like to present themselves as something which gives us sort of unmediated access into what people actually think. There are many, many layers through which we have to look at this. The fact that each of the polls that I'll be telling you about was conducted by sometimes different companies at different times, using different languages, different words rather, to express themselves is really important. So when people respond to public opinion polls, they're not necessarily sharing their unmediated views. They're responding to a question that's been put to them in a particular way. And sometimes the wording, especially when it came to Indonesia, was very, very artificial or tendentious. It was leading people towards certain answers. Sample sizes, methodologies, all those sorts of things which seem quite boring are actually incredibly important when it comes to polling. Change a few words around, throw in a don't know option, ask a certain group of people as opposed to a different group of people, and you get entirely different responses. So it's really much more of a creative process, I want to suggest, that I'm talking about. Not necessarily, the fact of what Australians thought, but how that was brought out in certain ways through that sort of, craft perhaps of public opinion polling. So we're going to take all that into account, and we're going to realise that all of the things that I'm saying, that we are aware that there's very huge limitations here, and as I say, they do become part of the story. So just to work out, what does it actually say? So for now, let's focus in on what these results are. What did Australians think about Indonesians in that most sort of basic way that these polls would want to suggest, and how did we know this? At which points were these questions asked? As I suggested, the first poll, and I know that's a bit smaller than it should be thanks to our technical difficulties, but I'll tell you everything you need to know, so don't worry if you can't read it. The first time that Australians were polled about Indonesia, and mostly the patterns in subsequent periods, was when something was happening in Indonesia that was seen as perhaps being problematic for Australia. At very few points in this long history of polling of Australian opinions about Indonesia has it just come out of the blue, as in like, what do you think about Indonesian people? Or what do you think about Indonesian culture? It's very often been framed about politics, and especially framed by crisis. And this pattern was set from the very beginning. So these earliest polls were about what Australians thought of the emerging Indonesian Republic. And this is in the period between the Declaration of Indonesian Independence in 45, but before its ratification in 49. So, it was a live issue. What should happen in Indonesia? And actually, the responses were, on the whole, about indecision. So the majority of, it wasn't a total majority. The December 45 poll, the first one, found that 41% of Australians favoured the Dutch retaining their colony. 29% wanted independent Indonesia. Most couldn't, wanted a different scenario. There were a few options that they were given. And that sort of stayed the same. There was indecision here. It was related to domestic politics in Australia as well. But it wasn't, so it was about the way that, the indecision that they were finding was sort of this picture of indecision. It was another quote that was used. But it was actually presented as being much stronger than what the results showed. So as you see, the headline that the Gallup organisation in Australia, APOP, Australian Public Opinion Polling, the way that they publicised it was "Let Dutch rule the East Indies." So again, another way in which, this is a minority report. At best, the strongest support for the Dutch retaining their colony was only over 41%. But because that was the single biggest percentage, it was presented as if this was a clear majority. To show you again how low that level of support actually was for the Dutch retaining Indonesia. This is from January 45 to January 49. It never actually really reached that peak of 41% ever again. The idea that some sort of a condominium could be reached, that the UN could take over was thrown in, and opinions weren't that strong. The same process perhaps was even amplified in the West New Guinea issue. And I know that for some of you this looks like a deep past, why are we going so far back? But actually it's really important because, as I'll sort of be suggesting, a lot of the issues that we still see in how Australians perceive Indonesia really began to firm up around this time. So the West New Guinea issue was important, and then confrontasi in the following decades was important as well in the 60s. But again, we see this same pattern of asking Australians what they think about Indonesia during periods of crisis, political crisis, about getting sort of wishy-washy results, but then presenting them in extremely strong language. So again, we do not want independence in New Guinea being the headline, the way in which this was reported. Now, the West New Guinea issue, I think, is a fantastic one if you ever want to look at how public opinion polling is politicised. The questions were completely unbalanced. If you look at the wording of the questions, there was a little preface before the question was put, who do you want to run West New Guinea? There was a little preface about Indonesian propaganda and how we mustn't, fall prey to what the Indonesian propaganda has been telling us. Even more importantly, though, the fact is that the whole question was skewed by APOP putting up this idea that perhaps Australia could take over in West New Guinea, which, if you know your history or if you were alive at the time, you know was never an option. It was never raised by Australia, it was never raised by the Dutch, it was never raised by Indonesia, it was never raised by the UN as something that might be considered. But Australian public opinion polling constantly put this before the public. Would you like Indonesia to take over? Would you like the Dutch to stay in West New Guinea? Would you like Australia to take over? Or would you like the UN? And as you can see, the green line, until 1956, the strongest point of popular opinion was saying actually Australia needs to take over. There should be an Australian colony. And that was incredibly strong, and it was only at the moment that you can see the green line drops off that the UN, which was the next favoured option, became what Australians wanted. So Australians never wanted either the Dutch or the Indonesians in Western New Guinea. They actually wanted Australia or they wanted the UN, which is interesting, but not as interesting as the fact that the public opinion polls were putting this as an option to the public. So rather than measuring public opinion, this is in a way radicalising it. It's putting this extreme option that no one was taking seriously in political circles and suggesting it to the public. And of course, this was also getting traction in the media. The next slide shows how strong the response was in the media. So keep Indonesians out, say nearly all Australians, because we've given people so many options that the percentage who wanted Indonesia to take over was always in the single digits. So that meant there was a very small level of public opinion, of public support for Indonesia, partly because the support had been diluted and partly because of that sort of red herring of Australia taking over, being there. And that was also sort of taken up by the press. So that APOP idea that Australia should go in was reported. So for example, the headline in the Courier Mail was saying Australia should try to take it over herself. You know, this became part of the popular discourse, having been suggested by popular opinion. In the years since, this is a bit of a, sorry for the time gallop through history. In the years since, during the Suharto period in particular, we began to see what is now still the case. Australians have both strong support for Indonesia, but also a strong sense of threat coming from Indonesia. And it depends on when you ask, and it depends on how you frame the question. So from the 70s to the 90s, quite a lot of opinion polling was asking what Australians thought about Indonesia. Here, you can't read that at all. They're from the same poll. This is the United States International Communications Agency poll. So the United States was asking Australians what they wanted as part of their broader information and intelligence gathering. It's asking countries with which it's very important for Australia to have close political ties in 1975, in which Indonesia comes fourth after the US, Britain and Japan. So, you know, a lot of Australians want closer relations, closer ties. But then it's also asking which one you'd like to have closer relations, and as you'll see in the next slide, it's also asking where the threat is. Polling around the same period, so this is an age poll from 1977, showing that it was an important country but also viewed as aggressive. So by this time, Australians had really got the idea that Indonesia was aggressive. And this is of course 1977, being after East Timor. So I'm suggesting that this is a dual track, if you want to put it in sort of the soft language, cognitive dissonance, if you want to actually work out what the hell is going on in Australian minds, that you hold these two not necessarily contradictory. There is a way in which you can make sense of having them both at the same time, but there's no evidence that that was necessarily what's happening. So, you know, interpret it how you will. So during this period, we get that sort of the idea that Indonesia is a threat, it's expanding, but it's also something that Australians want to have more to do with rather than less. So not to close away from Indonesia as perhaps previous White Australia policies had suggested, but to actually engage, to build up more contact, more political talks, more cultural interaction. And this has been happening ever since, really. And interestingly, the idea that threat perception has only been getting stronger. It's been getting stronger since the 80s, but particularly since the 1990s, when the Australian Electoral Study began to track this. So this is a survey that's sent out after every election, so they've been very busy recently, in which people answer all sorts of things to explain their voting patterns. And security perception is one of those. So since 1993, Australians have been saying really staggering things about how frightened they are of Indonesia as a security threat. In 1993, 55% of respondents thought that Indonesia would threaten Australian security within the next 5 years. And 57% believed it would present a threat to Australian security within 10 to 15 years. That went up, so it peaked in the 89% from memory. It was very strong, and every time this survey is conducted, it gets a huge amount of press. So after that first finding, the 1993 finding, that so many Australians actually perceive Indonesia as a threat, quite a significant amount of media, academic and policy attention was turned for the first time to this question of why are Australians afraid of Indonesia. So trying to build programs, Paul Keating in 1994 did the business showcase that he ran to Indonesia, which at the time was one of the largest cross-country, non-political, non-military agreements at the time. It cost $12 million. And Paul Keating at the launch talked about how this might be a corrective to the negative perceptions that Australians hold of Indonesia. That if we learn more about each other, that can only be to the good. So that this polling is what gave the bolster to a lot of that language. Why is it happening is an interesting and important question that I don't think we see coming out in the polling. But we can, it's one of the things that we do need to find out more. Polling tends to just give the, it takes the symptoms. It doesn't find the cause of the problem. However, you can sort of see a few different things happening at the same time, and especially if you look at what historians have been telling us for a long time, which is that Australian ideas about Australian nationhood formed during the White Australia period are formed against this idea of Asian other and Asian invasion. So people like David Walker, whose book Anxious Nation I've put up, talk about invasion fears during the early parts of the 20th century, which perhaps correlate quite closely to the same sort of ideas that were happening in the 90s. So those of you who remember Tomorrow When the War Began, the sort of staggeringly popular youth thriller in which an unnamed Asian country, Indonesia, invades or sets up a huge invasion of Australia, as picking up exactly where the invasion narratives about China or Japan in the early 20th century had left off. So this is sort of perhaps a little bit of an idea that finding out more of what's happening is important. We might be able to plot statistics, as in what percentage of Australians are afraid of Indonesia, but working out why sometimes requires a different disciplinary approach. Looking back, it's also important to see that this threat perception wasn't so much necessarily about Indonesia. It's just as much about Australia. So that there is also from the electoral study showing what Australians, the percentage of Australians who think that it's possible for Australia to defend itself. And that is always abysmally low. So 3.2% of Australians strongly agreed in 1996 that Australia would be able to defend itself successfully. And so perhaps when you start to correlate those two, as historians have been telling us about Australia for a long time, the fear might not necessarily be of Indonesia and of what Indonesia does, but that it's the most cogent threat present to Australia in a post-Cold War period. And if we know that Australia can't defend itself, then that fear can sort of be pushed off onto whoever might possibly take on the role as the invader. And it's true if you look at polling in the 80s and the 90s, that as Russia, North Vietnam and China stopped being seen as a threat, Indonesia jumped up as the most sort of the only cogent threat in the post-Cold War period. So, I don't want to stress this too much. I think you can see the sort of pattern that's emerging. The only thing I will say is that in the last 10 or 15 years, more polling has been conducted about Indonesia in Australia than ever before. The Lowy Institute poll, we know, it happens every year, and that's sort of measured, and politicians pay attention to that, the media pays a lot of attention to that when it comes out. DFAT in 2013 conducted a huge and very expensive poll, which was 17 minutes long when it was done at the time, and measured, in much more detail what Australians do and don't know about Indonesia. Every time these polls come out, the main point is we don't know much at all. We want to be closer, but we're afraid. So all of the things that have been coming out for decades now are now becoming more and more prominent. But perhaps more surprising than that is the idea that it is quite stable. If you look at where Australian attitudes measure in that Lowy poll, so it's distilled into a temperature gauge, how warm are sentiments, there's actually, despite the fact that over the period of the long polling, there's been numerous crises. So there's been the Chappelle-Corby case, the cattle, the executions, all of these things that we've been told have huge impacts on how Australians think of Indonesia. In fact, the level of variability in that level of warming is lower than what other nations, so the United States, for example, fluctuates more than Indonesia in the public opinion polling. So I think that's the interesting point to be taken away. Not that Australians are sort of ambivalent, we've known that for a while, but that ambivalence is actually much steadier than the sort of wild fluctuations we've been told to expect is. So to bring it back, I did sort of, as I say, looking at all of these results over such a long time, the largest question that sort of came up is, why do we keep asking if we know that the answers, especially over the last 10 or 15 or 30 years, have been very steady? And what are the real outcomes of this? Every time there's polling, think back to that West New Guinea sort of politicisation. Every time there's polling, that draws attention to Australian ignorance of Indonesia, all the negative aspects of it. Very rarely, as I said, is there ever a headline saying, you know, Australians happy with Indonesia. But every time there's polling that takes place, it provides another trigger for that sort of sense of panic, sense of fluctuation, sense of crisis that's been marking Australian, or been seen to be marking Australian-Indonesian relations. Which brings us back to Yudhoyono and that sort of sense that this is the largest and most important point in Australian-Indonesian relations. You know, is it, if you're sort of looking at it in that level of stability? And how, you know, what is the outcome of all of this polling if you're constantly asking Australians to reflect on Indonesia as a threat? The broader question that I'm now starting to ask, which is very different to that one that I came to, isn't what have Australians thought about Indonesia over the last 70 years, but how has the point that they've been asked so many times sort of constructed this idea that Indonesia is a threat, that we need to keep our eye on it, and that we need to keep informed of, you know, what we think, what they think, what all of this might mean. The idea that perhaps the polling industry helps construct that sense of threat as much as measure it is the point that I'm starting to reach. So thank you. I know that was wild and